Look at this. I got a coat on. I want everybody to be impressed. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Be present, O Jesus, our great high priest, as you are present with your disciples. And as you taught your disciples a radically new way of living, so teach us. Give light to our minds that we might understand what you're asking, and courage to our hearts that we might do it. All these things we ask of the Father in your name. Amen. For those of you who have lived elsewhere, like 13 years in Chicago, I always get tickled when Texans think this is cold. Good morning. There's no way in God's good green earth we're going to get through this in 30 minutes, but we're going to try. Thank you, Ed. And I've got you'll notice this is a little different than what I've done in the past, because I got another passage down below. If we can get to it, I'd like to. These are some of the most difficult teachings Jesus left us. Hey, buddy. They really are challenging, especially if you're an alpha male with a bad temper. I don't know anybody like that. There you go, Dick. Huh?
Sorry.
Don't be sorry. You're the only person here under 70. Hey. Boy, that elicited a response. Let's see what Jesus says about that. I'm going to come back to the business last week about making peace with your accuser on the way to court. And remember what N.T. Wright was arguing was that the significance of that is what you're trying to do is to bring Peggy. Here, Dick, if you would, give this to Peggy, give one to Peggy, and then put the rest back there in the back. Thank you. As N.T. Wright frames it, and you can argue this pro and con all day long, but as N.T. Wright frames it, the idea here is to do what you can to introduce peace into your culture, into your society. And there will be circumstances where, in effect, you apologize even though you know you're in the right. The reason for this last little passage is, but there's limits to the utility of that. Does anybody know what the word enabler means? I mean, you get the idea. We have to come back to that, but there comes a point where apologizing when you know you're in the right actually is counterproductive and harmful to the other person. And we'll come back to that in a minute, but what N.T. Wright is basically saying is that what Jesus is talking about there is this is what you do for the larger culture, so that the larger culture comes to understand what it means to be a Christian. And remember, Christians should not be like the Easter chicken. We ought to look differently. Remember my story about the Easter chicken? Okay, I'll just do this very briefly. When we were kids today don't do this. I think we figured out this is cruel. But you could go to your local store around Easter time and they had all these chicks that had been dipped in different colored dyes. But what happens if you get your kid a chick and the chick grows up? What do the feathers look like in 6 months? Everybody else. I mean, the point of it is, and the idea behind the Easter chicken is that for a few weeks, the Easter chicken looks different. And the rest of the time, you can't tell the difference. And part of the significance of that teaching of Jesus about making peace with your accuser on the way to the court is you ought to always look different. But this next passage is where the rubber hits the road, and it's hard. Now, the NRSV is on the left. That's the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In case you haven't figured out, very simply, whenever Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, he's quoting the Old Testament. And it's really important to understand that, because you got to ask yourself the question, who can improve upon the Old Testament? Now, this is a Jew speaking to Jews. If he's saying, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, it's a pretty extraordinary assertion of authority. You see my point? You have heard that the United States Constitution says, but I say unto you. You see the point? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Right. How many of us can actually pull that off? But I think he really means it. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. You want my coat? Here, take this as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Can you spell sucker? I mean, think about it. If we actually abided by this, what would we look like? Now, either he really didn't mean it, and by the way, preachers are absolute masters of saying, here's what Jesus said, but he didn't really mean it. Or he really meant it, we got to figure out what it looks like to live this way. Now look what, I'm trying to remember, this is terrible. The older I get, the harder a time, I wore the coat a little bit. The older I get, the harder time I have remembering names. It's just terrible. The guy who did the message, I can't think of his name, it'll come to me in a minute, but I love the way he's taken this and paraphrased it. Say it again? Eugene Peterson, thank you. I keep wanting to say Eugene Robinson. No, that's the bishop in New Hampshire, so okay. Here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. And if someone strikes you, stand there and take it. If someone drags you into court and sues for the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best coat and make a present of it. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. Now, that no more tit-for-tat stuff, live generously, is manifestly not there in the original text, but I love it. You know, you've heard me talk a lot about the two halves of life, but it's so important to understand the difference. I talk about there's two economies. The economy we're all born into is the quid pro quo economy. I give you X amount of dollars, you let me have a car. You hit me, I hit you back. Now, you got to think of developmentally here. If you go back to the origin of, you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, when that was first articulated in the Old Testament, what God was saying is all you get for an eye is an eye. Because the practice has been, you take my eye, I kill your family. In other words, this constant cycle of escalating violence. And what that was actually meant in the Old Testament was to put a limit on how much punishment you could exact for an act. And what Jesus is saying is don't punish at all. But notice what he's doing. He's taking us out of the quid pro quo economy and putting us in the gift economy. And if we live in the gift economy, the economy of grace, if somebody hits us, we need to give them the opportunity to strike the other side. That is extraordinarily challenging. How many of you have seen the movie Gandhi? Okay, if you haven't seen it, go watch it again, and it's an extraordinary thing. My own conviction is that Gandhi was probably the greatest man of the 20th century, and it's an interesting thing. He read the Bible every morning. Now, he was very much a Hindu. But the great thing about being a Hindu is I'm a Hindu, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, it doesn't really, they all matter. But there's this beautiful scene where he teaches the young priest what it means to turn the other cheek. Because they're walking, I think it's in South Africa, on the sidewalk, and two young white guys come up and they're going to knock the Indian guy off the sidewalk. And he said, no, let's keep walking. And the priest says, you've read your scriptures, right? And, turn the other cheek. And he said, well, I don't think he meant that literally. And Gandhi said, well, I think he did. And what happens is they walk right up to the two white kids, and one of them is about to just slug the bejeebers out of Gandhi, and the most powerful creature in the universe stops it. Mama shows up. It says, leave him alone. But the point Gandhi is making with the young priest is you still stand for the truth. You're just willing to bear the punishment for standing for the truth, because the effect of it is that it appeals to your abuser's conscience. And that actually sums up in toto Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. Now, second verse. I read an article one time, and I never will forget this. May God be praised that the English were in charge of India. If it had been the Nazis, they'd have just lined them up against the wall and shot them all. So the point is, you still got to be reasonable about this. But Gandhi got that principle from Jesus. It's really worth noting. So, first economy, quid pro quo, this for that. I'll give you what something is worth. You do something bad to me, I'll do something equally bad to you. Gift economy, grace economy. Remember that in Greek, those words are very closely related. Everything's a gift, and because I recognize that everything is a gift from God, I live my life a certain way. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Now lift your eyes. What in the world does that mean? He makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. What do you think he's saying there? This is here. I want to hear answers. We all live in the same world. And who gives us sunlight and who gives us rain? Charlie. Say it again. Amen to that. But I think there's something else. Remember the gift economy? Sunlight and rain are gifts, and God bestows them equally on everybody. When you begin to live in the gift economy, you come to understand God's showering his gifts on everybody. Notice what happens. And go over to Peterson. You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer. For then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. Now, again, this is a paraphrase, and Peterson is reading into the text. There are people who would argue that's not there. I actually am profoundly convinced it's there. I've come to think of the true self this way. I think God created all of us with an image in mind of whom he wants each of us to be. So there really is a Dick, there really is a Leslie, there really is a Doug, there really is a Harry, there really is a Kathy. I mean, you get the idea. And the challenge of life is to live our lives in such a manner that we have eyes to see and ears to hear, to know who it is God's calling me to be. One of the greatest illusions out there is that priests have calls, everybody else has occupations. The truth of the matter is, everybody has a call. And the challenge is to discern that call and to accept it and to embrace it. Now, that's your true self. It's more than just your call, your occupation, but the idea is God really does have in mind somebody and something he wants each of us to be. And I'm sure I've shared this story before, but let me share it very briefly. There's a wonderful youth program called the Logos Youth Program. It's very labor intensive, and I'm an old man, so but it's a fabulous program. And when I went to the initial training, one of the things that they do in the program, it's a midweek thing premised upon Acts 2:42, the four marks of the church. They were together daily offering the prayers, fellowship, celebrating Eucharist and having a meal together. But one of the things, you always have a class. And they had a class in this guy's church where and it could be on anything. And they had an old retired mechanic. And they got the mechanic to teach a class on being a mechanic, on automotive mechanics. Boys, teenage boys, came out of the woodwork. That class was incredibly well attended. Now, here's the reason I'm going with the story. The pastor, who was a Lutheran pastor, was sharing this story, started crying when he shared this story. He said, that guy came to me and said, this is the first time in my entire life that anybody has recognized my gift for working with cars as a gift from God. But you hear the point. This was this guy's vocation. This was his purpose in life. And it was a gift from God. And that pastor inadvertently recognized that when he asked him to teach this class. Now, you hear my point. Ain't nobody doesn't have a true self. So I love the fact that Peterson's built that in there. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer, for then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. Let's go back over to the left side. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And what was Matthew? He was a tax collector. And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And then this verse that makes us all crazy. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. You should see your face, Leslie. Okay, that doesn't apply to anybody here but Leslie. Leslie, you must be perfect. The word translated there, perfect, it's a horrible translation of that word. It's universal. They do it everywhere. I must go back to the King James Bible or something. The word there in Greek is teleos. Okay, big deal. I wrote basically a whole thesis on what that word actually means. And the idea is a telos is a goal in a race. It's a finish line. So the idea is to be, I'll go ahead and say it this way, to be perfect is to run the race well and cross the line the way God meant you to. Unfortunately, have you ever known a thoroughly neurotic Christian terrified of doing anything wrong? Oh, come on, you've all known such people. They make me crazy. But, you know, the person who's got to do everything just so and just be sure that everybody around them is just, you know, Jesus is not saying here, you therefore must be OCD as your father is OCD. He's not arguing for that kind of, that notion of perfection, and it's very important to hear this. One of the things that Christians do to give ourselves bad press is becoming unduly concerned about details that bloody don't matter. You know, that is, and by the way, one of the things I love about Anglicanism is that of the great traditions, we do that less than others. But what's going on here with this word is the better translation is, and generally speaking, I remember when I started studying this word and realized it's a very common word in the New Testament, but every place else it's used, it's not translated perfect, it's translated mature. What Jesus is saying is, if you really want to live as a mature Christian, this is how you will deal with people who give you a hard time, who strike you on the right cheek. So the really mature Christian is the person who can walk into a situation of conflict and not strike back. And one of my favorite sayings is, I will not defend, counterattack, blame, or argue. I'm really good at that until my feet hit the floor in the morning. But I will not defend, counterattack, blame, or argue. That's something very similar to what Jesus is after here. Is this making sense? You see what he's after? So the idea is, it is worth noting, I'm not a pacifist. I want to be very clear about that. But the earliest Christians, I mean the pre-Constantinian Christians, were. And it's just worth noting, and they basically saw themselves as God's instruments for bringing about an extraordinary change in culture, and therefore they would not strike back. I never will forget watching one of the old Bible movies made in the 50s with Richard Burton. And at the end of the movie, he and his girlfriend are martyred, but we don't see them being eaten by lions. We see them walking on the clouds into heaven. But there's one scene, it's Richard Burton, it's a Hollywood movie, there has to be a sword fight, right? Well, had Richard Burton really been a first century Christian, there would not have been a sword fight. Now, do with that what you will, but it's worth noting they actually took this literally. Have you ever noticed that when people are really concerned to take the Bible literally, what they mean is you got to think creation happened in 7 days. They don't mean you got to literally abide by the commandments of Jesus. And there's a whole school of thought in ethics. What I mean by that is this. I'll argue with you about how long it took to create the world, but there's no way I'm going to turn my other cheek. You know, if you really want to be a fundamentalist, if you really want to get back to fundamentals, try literally applying the teachings of Jesus. Now, this is hard, and it's not always the right and prudent thing to say, to do. Many of you will have known addicts, you'll have had cousins, kinspeople, friends, whatever, and you know there comes a point where you got to draw a line in the sand for the sake of the person. And parents. I had a good friend who sons kept coming home, and he said, Doug, I've done everything I can to keep them from coming home. I even put axle grease on the doorknobs, you know. But there comes a point where you got to say, enough. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is, this is the reason I wanted to show you what's in Matthew 18. But there's a distinction here I've only caught for the first time. If another member of the church sins against you, and if who? Another member of the church. Now see, that's very important to notice. Matthew 18 is not delivered to Christians for living in the larger society. Jesus is talking about members of the church. You know, so if somebody does something to me in the church, here's what you're supposed to do. Go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. So he is not saying, no matter what, apologize always. If the other guy's in the wrong, be honest about it. Stand your ground. Be clear, be kind, turn the other cheek, but speak the truth. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. Now, let me ask you a question. If I'm asking you to listen to me, what courtesy do I owe you? I have to listen to you. See, Jesus is not saying here, if you've been offended and think you're in the right, if you really want to pursue reconciliation, you got to be open to the possibility that you're not. And so what Jesus is saying here is, if you've been hurt, if you've been offended by somebody, go share the effect of their behavior on you, but be prepared to listen to the effect of your behavior on them. You may come to understand things you hadn't understood before. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, Samson, you know, I've done my best. I've listened to you. You've not heard what I'm saying. This continues to cause me pain, and it continues to put the community at risk. I'm going to bring some witnesses. We're going to try this again. Now, notice what happens when you expand the circle that way. You've got other people listening to the other person as well as you. You're still taking the risk that somebody's going to say to you, no, you're in the wrong, Doug. You know, but if you're not in the wrong and the other person won't listen to you, then the community is beginning to make a stand, to take a stand on what's right or wrong in this given situation. And notice where it goes from there. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, the word that's there translated as a church in the original Greek is actually Sanhedrin. which is basically the Jewish ruling council. In other words, if we were doing a more literal translation, it would say, take it to the vestry. Now, let me ask an enormous favor of you. If you have a real conflict with another member of the church, don't take it to the vestry. Life is complicated enough. But you hear what I'm saying. The idea here is you go up the chain of command, so to speak, in a particular community to seek reconciliation. But the idea is you got to be as willing to listen as you are to speak. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Now I want to say something. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is asking the disciples, who do you say that I am? And finally, Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And he says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. From this time forward, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The way the Roman Catholic, this is one of the places I really do differ with the Roman Catholic Church. They actually argue that in that statement, Jesus gave Peter and his successors, namely popes, the authority to forgive or to not forgive sins. I don't think that's what's going on here at all. Have any of you ever resented anybody? Okay, let me give you a definition of resentment. Resentment is poison I drink in hopes of hurting you. It accomplishes absolutely no good thing. And if you go to the big book, they tell you it very clearly. The single emotion most liable to land an alcoholic back in a situation where he starts drinking again is resentment. It's poison to the soul. Listen to what Jesus says here. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Let it go. He's not saying the church has the authority to forgive or for not give sins. Technically, well, this is not, since Vatican II, a lot of this has changed, but classically, if you wanted your sins forgiven in the Roman Church, you had to go to confession. For us, the rule on confession has always been available to all, required of none, suggested for some. And so I can do sacramental confessions with people. The only time I think it's advised is if you've done something that you just feel awful about and you can't get rid of the awful feeling. You can't get over it. I really did that. And that's a very useful time to use confession. But in this regard, we're Protestant. All of us can go to God and say, God, I'm really sorry, and anticipate receiving forgiveness. Now, you may have to make restitution, but you don't have to have a priest between you and God. That's not what's going on here. What he's saying is, if you don't let it go, it's going to rot your soul. So, the point I'm trying to make very simply is last week, I don't want you to go away from this thinking. Jesus said, always apologize even if you're absolutely in the right. I love Ewell. He can't be with us today, by the way. He was in a car wreck the other night, and he's okay. He totaled his car. He hit a deer. And when you're driving a Toyota Corolla, that will have an effect. But Ewell apologizes a lot. And I finally looked at him one day and said, Ewell, quit apologizing. It's a matter of, it's different cultures. He's just very, very inclined to automatically say, I'm sorry. The point I'm making is always apologizing is not what God was after, nor what Jesus was after in that passage from last week. I think he is saying that there are times when you apologize in order to bring peace to the situation. But in the grand scheme of things, it's also important to recognize that you matter as much as somebody else, and somebody else matters as much as you. And in the church, final thing and I'll stop, notice this is directed to our conduct within the confines of the church. Matthew 5 through 7 is actually talking about how we conduct ourselves in a larger society. It is 9:30 and 16 seconds. Questions, thoughts, comments, responses? Have I done too much too quickly? Yes, ma'am. There's no simple answer to that. My first response is don't move to New Jersey. I do think our culture has gotten meaner, but I also see signs of hope. I think part of what happened Tuesday is our culture is saying if you lose an election, you lost an election, live with it, and don't threaten me with violence if you don't like what's going on. But that element is always there in the collective psyche. And the challenge is for people to acknowledge that the whole idea behind democracy is the peaceful transition of power. And the second verse of it is, though, in terms of the larger culture, and I think these are all related, social media. I remember when I was at the seminary, we had a fantastic enrollment officer, and she rode my case to get on Twitter. And I finally just said, Jenny L., I'm an English major. I refuse to spend my life in a world of sentence fragments. I just told her I wasn't going to do it. Then I retired. But the point I'm making is very simply, I think part of what we're seeing is a culture where people are constantly doing this, and we've lost actual contact with each other. I also think, I'm going where angels fear to tread, but I also think what's happened is, remember when we were kids, there were 3 networks, and there was the fairness doctrine. And if you offered one side of an issue, you had to offer the other side of the issue. How many networks are there now? And there's no fairness doctrine. Now, how do you have freedom of the press without giving people license to go out and just spew all kinds of nonsense? Before I came here, I was working over at I was just doing Sunday services over at St. Mary's in Hillsborough, and I never will forget driving through Cleveland on the way home, and there were all these people around the courthouse with placards protesting children being sold into sexual slavery. What? So I went home and Googled it, and there was a theory out there that one of the parties was using pizza parlors to tempt young children in to buy pizza, and then they'd kidnap them and sell them into sexual slavery. There was a great big billboard driving in from Fort Worth which said, don't let Beto groom your children. There's absolutely no evidence that Beto's grooming anybody's children, but that kind of extremism, at least for a time, has carried the day. I think the culture's saying enough, and I take that as a good sign. Final thing, and I really do need to stop. The only way I know how to respond to that, Lisa, is to not respond in kind. And for me, that's a challenge. But that's all I know. Jesus' basic point, you're the leaven and the bread. You're the salt of the earth. Let people taste the flavor of people who don't do that. It has nothing to do with politics per se, nothing to do with stances on issues. It has to do with how we treat each other. So, anyway, there you have it. Yeah, there are a few folk here under 70. Go in peace, love, and serve the Lord.